Today's scripture is from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18, verses 1 to 6, and then 24 through 26. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, he would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince the Jews and the Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him, in protest, he shook the dust off from his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Now there came to Ephesus a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria. He was an eloquent man, well versed in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord. And he spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
So we reach that time of the year when our thoughts turn to things like ham and turkey and all the things that come with Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving is an interesting holiday, and it's got a very interesting tradition here, especially in the United States. It's one of those, the way that we do Thanksgiving is really uniquely American. I remember working with folks from Germany one year when I was in college, and we were going back and forth, and they were like, "Okay, well, can we have a meeting about this tomorrow?" And I said, "No, we can't have a meeting about that tomorrow. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving, so I'm not working tomorrow." And they're like, "Oh, what are you giving thanks for?" And I'm like, "Well, everything." And then it became this whole conversation about, well, what do you do? And I'm like, well, really, we just eat food as part of it. And I think at one point, one of them snickered, and that says, "Yes, that sounds very American of you. You just sit around and eat food." I'm like, "Yep, that's what we do." But obviously, the idea is to be thankful. And there's this history, there's a kind of a surface history of Thanksgiving that most of us know or have encountered. And oftentimes that history has to do something with like pilgrims that wore funny hats and things like that. Now, there was actually in Plymouth Bay Colony in 1621 a fall after a lot of hardship that was a particularly good harvest. And the people of the colony did have a feast, and they did sit down and eat that food, not only with themselves, but with the Native Americans around them. That did, in fact, happen. Now, as far as best we can tell, the Native Americans actually weren't specifically invited. They just kind of happened to show up. And they showed up because they heard the colonists shooting off a bunch of guns in celebration, and they kind of wanted to know what was going on. And instead of it leading to any sort of conflict, they decided to eat and break bread together. Now, again, that did happen, and it did happen in 1621. It did not happen again after that. Right? So there was not a tradition of this happening in the early life of America. And the idea of this being associated with Thanksgiving as we know it today is something that really kind of came along and didn't kind of get grafted into the holiday until the earliest 20th century. So it's not that it's necessarily wrong to remember this meal or the pilgrims or anything like that, but it's not actually why or how the holiday actually got started in the first place. And for me, the actual story is frankly far more interesting and in some ways a far more helpful history to us today. Now, the actual history of Thanksgiving dates to really one person, and that person is a woman named Sarah Hale. Most of us have probably not heard of Sarah Hale, or if we have, it's because she shows up as an answer in Trivial Pursuit to one of two questions. One question would be, who is the originator of Thanksgiving? And the correct answer would be Sarah Hale. The other question that may come up is, who is the original author of Mary Had a Little Lamb? And the correct answer is Sarah Hale. So, if she's known for anything at all, or is remembered today at all, that is one of the two things she is remembered for. But this really wasn't an idea that Sarah just came up with on her own and decided to do. It wasn't something that she came to lightly. But the idea of creating Thanksgiving as a holiday was actually a passionate pursuit for her for decades. Now, Sarah was born in 1788, and because she was born to a family who had this radical idea within their family that daughters should be educated every bit as much as sons should be, which was a bit of a nutty idea in the late 18th, early 19th century, she actually got an education. And she got an education and went off to become a school teacher. And through being a school teacher, became an author, and then eventually became the editor, a writer, and then the editor of a popular women's magazine, because those were a thing. Not like Cosmo, by the way, something else. And so she became a popular author in the 19th century of a women's magazine. In fact, she was so that she was so successful at it that another publisher actually bought that magazine for the only reason of basically acquiring her as the editor. And then finally she was put on charge of another magazine. And it was through that writing that she began to popularize and talk about this idea of thankfulness and this idea that we needed a day, specifically in the fall, to remind us to be thankful. Right? And she specifically wanted to do it in the fall because for her, especially for her as a person of faith and who was raised in the Christian tradition, she looked at things like the harvest and all of the hard work of the hands that go into the harvest that happens in the fall as this amazing coming together of both the hard work of people, because you don't get to reap if you don't sow it in the first place, but also a recognition that you can put all the seeds in the ground that you want. There is a huge part of that process that we are not in charge of. We are not in charge of the weather. We are not in charge of the soil. We are not in charge of whether the seeds actually germinate or anything like that. So for her, the harvest was this wonderful embodiment of both the hard work of people combining with God's blessing, because you can only thank God for the bountifulness of the earth and what the earth does in her mind, and that those things combined together should be something that we are thankful for. And so in 1846, she began to write letters to the presidents of the United States, and she continued to write letters from 1846 all the way up to 1863. Every time there was a new administration, one of the things that they would get, along with everything else, is a letter from Sarah Hale, campaigning for the idea of there being a national day of Thanksgiving, a federally recognized day where we sit together and we celebrate together home, we celebrate together family and friend, and we celebrate together the blessing that God has put into each of our lives. And those letters go either unanswered or ignored, again, until 1863. Now, if you remember your history, there's something going on in 1863. One, Lincoln is president, and two, the Civil War. And we are right smack dab in the middle of the Civil War, which is arguably the darkest period in American history. And it is during that time that Abraham Lincoln receives a letter from Sarah Hale, still campaigning, despite everything that is happening in the country, despite all of the terrible news, despite everything else going on in the world, that we still, and in fact more now than ever, need to set aside some intentional time for thankfulness. Intentional time to reflect on the blessings God has for us. Intentional time for family and friends to gather. And it is in that moment that Abraham Lincoln sees the wisdom of what Sarah is suggesting, and that is the time we get the first official national proclamation of a day of Thanksgiving to be celebrated on the last Thursday of November. And we have continued to celebrate Thanksgiving on the last, later the 4th, because sometimes November has 5 Thursdays. They eventually codified it as the 4th Sunday, or the fourth Thursday of November, ever since. Now, and it's important to note that Thanksgiving then becomes, at that point, only the 3rd federally recognized holiday. And Thanksgiving is recognized as a federal holiday with a day off work and everything that comes with being a federal holiday before Christmas is. Only the 4th of July and George Washington's birthday, later known as President's Day, precedes it. It would be another 10 years before we get Christmas, and it would be much longer after that before we get things like Labor Day and Memorial Day. That's how important Sarah thought that taking time to be thankful was. So when we sit down around our table, and when we sit down with our friends and hopefully our family and enjoy good food, or however it is we are going to celebrate that day, we are not only celebrating that day together, we are able to do that. We are able to do that because of hard work that happened, because of a relentless campaign from a person whose name we probably don't remember over almost 200 years ago now, to make sure that we had that time and that space. Sarah planted the seeds of thankfulness in her time and in her life, and we are continuing to reap the harvest from them today, whether we know her name or not. I was reminded of this, of course, as I was thinking about the person that I know I wanted to talk about today, and that is Priscilla. Because Priscilla is somebody who is mentioned in the Bible. You just heard 2 of the 4 times she gets a shout out. But is not an overly well explored figure, though we know a ton about her by just what little bit the Bible chooses to tell us. And Priscilla is interesting for a couple of different reasons. One is she is usually mentioned alongside her husband Aquila. What's interesting is that most of the time when she is mentioned, she actually gets first billing. It's not Aquila and Priscilla most of the time. There's one place in the Bible where it's Aquila and Priscilla. Everywhere else, it is Priscilla and then Aquila. This would not have been normal in the time that she lived in the 1st century. And in fact, oftentimes, if you wanted to reference a couple in the 1st century, you only referenced the husband's name, and the wife's name was either considered unimportant or implied. So the fact that she not only gets named is a big deal. Anytime we see anybody with a name, an actual name in the Bible, we know something is going on, and we know that there's some importance there. So not only is it important she gets a name, but she actually gets listed first. So you can kind of read into that, if you want, what the dynamic of the relationship might be and who was probably actually in charge. No shade at Aquila. I'm sure he was a nice guy. But Paul and the authors of Acts are clearly signaling to us as the reader that in this combination, Priscilla was the important one. And she's important for a couple of reasons. One, we hear right from the beginning that they were expelled from Rome. Now, this happened in the 40s, and it happened because the emperor at the time decided that all the Jews in Rome were causing trouble. And we're not exactly sure what the causing trouble is. It's possible what they were causing trouble about is that there was a group of Jewish people in Rome that had learned about Jesus and were really excited about Jesus, and another group that wasn't all that excited about Jesus, and they were causing conflict with each other. It's argued that that might have been the problem, or whatever. We're not quite sure. All we know is that the Roman emperor at the time, Claudia, decides that he has had enough of this, so he just kicks them all out of the city and all out of that whole area. And they are forced to then leave and go find homes and make their way somewhere else. So Priscilla and Aquila find their way to Corinth, which was another popular trading city, because it was no longer safe for them where they were. And they find that there, and as we heard, they have the same profession as Paul. They're tent makers. So when Paul comes to Corinth with his message about Jesus and comes to that community to talk to them about Jesus and everything that he knew and learned about it, he finds them, and he finds them of similar and like mind. And so they start to basically hang out with and pal around with Paul. So much so that after Paul leaves and another person comes, well, actually, they leave together. They end up in Ephesus. Paul leaves and another person comes as another basically roaming itinerant preacher, of which there were lots at this time, talking about Jesus. Now, after Jesus ascends into heaven, there's all kinds of people who go out and go to all kinds of places to talk to people about him. It was Paul's the one we remember because he's the one who wrote most of the New Testament and names we know really well. But he was far from the only one. And they were all telling slightly different versions of things. And Paul, being Paul, was fairly certain he knew the correct and most right version. And so Priscilla and Aquila, having hung out with Paul, no doubt were steeped in his teaching and what he understood and what he was sharing about Jesus. So when this other guy, Apollos, shows up, and he is doing his teaching and preaching, we hear right from the beginning that he's a pretty charismatic guy. We're not sure exactly how or why, and it doesn't tell us that, but obviously he is the kind of person that when he speaks, people listen, right? And he speaks well, and he speaks eloquently. And we are told in there that he speaks the truth, and he understands about Jesus, and he teaches about Jesus, except he didn't quite have the baptism piece right. And in the early church, as in today, the idea of baptism and what that meant and the difference between John's baptism and Jesus' baptism, which is a whole other sermon, but you're not getting today, I promise. You're welcome. Is a big deal. But Paul is not there to set him straight. So instead, Priscilla and Aquila go to Apollos, this charismatic figure that everybody feels drawn to and is really excited about, and says, "We love what you're saying, but you don't have things quite right. And we need to tell you about something that you seem to have missed." Now, if you actually go into Paul's letters, Paul will write about Apollos, and there's this little obvious rivalry between the two, and it's really kind of funny because Paul throws a lot of shade at Apollos in his letters, and it's and of course Paul's are the ones that made it into the Bible. Apollos doesn't, so I always kind of feel bad because he's not there to defend himself. But also Paul likes to throw shade, and it's funny when he does it. All right. So they go, and this is not necessarily an easy thing to do. Aquila and Priscilla are themselves not the teachers that people are attracted to. Yes, they're hanging out with Paul, and they know of Paul, but it is not the safest thing for them to do to go to this new, otherwise charismatic and respected leader and say, "Oh, by the way, we need to tell you something. You don't have something quite right." And then we learn, if we read, we will read later in Paul's letter to Romans, at the very end, he will send his greetings to Priscilla and Aquila. Meaning that sometime between here, now, and when Paul eventually writes the letter to the Romans, they go back to Rome. They go back to that place that was unsafe for them. And they probably went back after Claudia died, which is helpful, so there wasn't as much persecution, but that isn't to say that people were excited to see them all come back. But Priscilla and Aquila, Priscilla especially, decides that that's where she needs to be, whether it's safe to be there or not. And she actually goes to Rome before Paul gets there, shares, no doubt, the teachings that she has learned from Paul, and no doubt is the one who probably carried and read aloud the letter to the Romans for the first time that anybody heard it. Modern scholars have argued that there's a decent amount of evidence that Priscilla may actually, in fact, be the author of the book of Hebrews, which, as of right, as has been the tradition forever, we don't technically know who the author is. The New Testament book of the Hebrews is one of the only books of the New Testament that isn't attributed to any specific person. And scholars have taken to arguing that there's a lot of evidence that Priscilla is probably the one who wrote it, and her name was left off for obvious first century sexist reasons. And that's why no other name has also been attached to it. Now, we don't know that for sure, but it's easily argued that that may be the case. Either way, whether she wrote that book or not, she was no doubt an important, quintessential, critical figure in the early life of the church. She carried the message of Jesus to far-flung places, And even though she is not and will never be as well known as Paul, and was clearly not as respected and as people were as excited about her as Apollos or any of the other people that we hear about in the book of Acts, her work was important. And it is arguable that it was her and people like her, people whose names we do not know at all, who were taking up the work that Paul took up to carry the message of Jesus to the far-flung places. It is arguable that we get to be here today. We get to stand in the tradition we stand in today. We have the writings of Paul and the stories of Christ because, not just because of Paul, but everybody around him who supported him and his ministry and carried his word to those other places. Because Paul's letters are great and wonderful, but we don't get to have them if they're not read, shared, and distributed. And it was people like Priscilla who did that work. She is the one name that we have from Acts and from the Bible that we know did that work. She was by far not the only one who did. All those other names are now lost to history. And yet, it is the seeds that that they planted. It is the seeds of faith that they planted in all the far-flung places and cities all throughout the known world at the time that we as Christians today continue to harvest in our traditions as we continue to live and love and follow the way of Jesus. I like the person of Priscilla, and I like her story, even though we don't know much about it. One of the reasons why I like it is it's far easier for me to imagine myself and people that I know and love in her role than some of the others. Because Priscilla fills that role that many of us do. The person doing the critical, important, but often overlooked and uncelebrated work. When we gather to be thankful this week, we ought to be thankful not just for those people we know and see, but there is no doubt untold multitudes that did things that we don't even know about that we are benefiting from today. So I have one more story. And it's about a woman named Cora. And Cora was born in 1876, or 1867. Cora. This is Cora. Cora was born in 1867 in New York City, or in New York State, that we don't hold that against her. And I'm sorry. Kimberly was born in New York, sounds like. But when Cora was 19 years old, she actually relocated to Colorado. So that would be in 1886. And she relocated with her new husband. And while she was here, she got involved in the church. And at the time, the church she got involved in were known as the United Brethren. And she got involved in the church, began to learn, began to study, and began to teach as part of that. So much so that in 1894, even though she was only 24 years old, she was actually ordained in that church. That is remarkable because the first woman ever to be ordained in the United Brethren tradition was only about 5 years before. So she was one of the very, very early women for whom we recognize that they had a gift for preaching and teaching, who was given the authority to do so, and down as part of the church that she was a part of down in Denver, and sent all the way north to the hinterlands of the Big Thompson River area to do some work and evangelize to those poor souls up there. So she became a circuit rider, which means she rode by horseback to all the various places, and really any place that people gathered, whether it was a church or not. In most of the places it was not, because there weren't churches yet. Whether it was schoolhouses or townhomes or fields or wherever it was, she would ride a circuit from place to place to place, bringing the good news of Jesus Christ to anybody and everybody she could possibly encounter. One of those places there she found a distinct amount of interest in her and what she was doing was on the farm of the Whitehall family, which is not too far from here. And in 1894, there was a group of them gathered in the Whitehall schoolhouse that got so inspired by what she was doing that they decided to gather the resources to build their own church. And they wanted to build their own church somewhere a little bit north of where they were. So they found a plot of land right around what is now Highway 60 and Highway 13, and built a chapel. That chapel would be named for Cora Dilly. So it would become Dilly Chapel. And the community that grew up around Dilly Chapel would become eventually known, not named for Cora Dilly, but actually named for her original family name, which is Elwell. So that area at 16 and at 13 and 60 would become known and eventually be incorporated as the town of Elwell. If you know anything about this area, you will know there's not a town there anymore. That is true, but there was. And in fact, there was a town in Elwell before there was a town in Johnstown, or a town in Milliken. That was the first town that was here. That name, of course, if you have spent any time in this area recently, you'll know the name of Elwell lives on as the name of the brand new elementary school that we built not too far from there a couple of years ago. Now, Sarah Dilly and the chapel there would actually, now Sarah Dilly would unfortunately only live to the age of 30. And in 1898, she actually died shortly after being remarried after her first husband passed of some sort of illness. They're not sure what, because it was 1898 and medicine wasn't all that good yet. So she passes away, but the chapel still exists, and the chapel still bears her name. The chapel actually eventually, after a while, unfortunately, the chapel actually burns down. They rebuild it in that same place, on that same corner. But over time, it becomes clear that Johnstown is going to be the town that is probably going to end up being the biggest one. So they decide to actually physically move, because apparently they did these things back then, the church from where it was to Elwell to where it is on Charlotte Street today. And in 1973, that Charlotte Street Dilly Chapel that Cora Dilly started in the city of Elwell, now in Johnstown, in 1973, that church was sold along with another one because there was another church built to take its place. This one. The cornerstone out here says 1973 because that's when we opened it, because two churches came together, sold the property that they had, and invested here. You may or may not know the name of Cora Dilly. If you're new here, you probably don't. But if we are sitting here, whether you are here in person or gathered online or however it is that you encounter the ministries of this place, you are part of the harvest of what Cora Dilly planted as seeds all those years ago. Know her name or not, though I suggest you do, it's a good story. What she did, the blessings she put out into the world, have multiplied over time in a way that she herself no doubt could never imagined. And we get to sit here today as beneficiaries of that harvest. Just as we are the beneficiaries of the harvest of Sarah Hale, just as we are beneficiaries of the harvest of Priscilla, just as we are the beneficiaries of the harvest of everybody else who labored in faith to do good work, to try their best to do what they felt God calling them to do, to reap the harvest of all of those who planted seeds, some of them only a year ago, some of them 100 years ago, some of them 1,000 years ago. We are the beneficiaries of all of those harvests. When we come to the table of thanksgiving, that is what we are giving thanks for. Yes, we are giving thanks for the food and the warmth and the family and the camaraderie and all of that. Yes, that's important. But we are also called to remember all of the folks whose names we remember and names we don't, who labored long and hard to plant seeds that would no doubt, that would grow into an abundance that they themselves would probably never see or know, that we ourselves today get to be the harvesters of. And, blessedly, we all get to be about the work of planting our own seeds, of doing the good work that God has called us to do, to doing the good work in this community that God wants for our church to do today, so that 1 year, 10 years, 100 years from now, there is another group of people who may or may not remember our names, who are being blessed by what we do. It is wonderful when history remembers your name. It is wonderful to have people to look back on whose lives we know well and we can celebrate. There are yet so many more, though, for whom the names have been lost to history, but the work is still so critically important. Our goal should not, probably, to be remembered. Our goal should be to do the work that God calls us to find the places where we are being asked to take some of the harvest we have received and replant it in new and different ways, so that 1 year, 10 years, 100 years from now, people will be blessed whether they remember us or not. Amen.